with Dr. Dreyer, who's a professor of political science at the University of Miami, an expert on China, probably one of the most knowledgeable scholars on the topic of contemporary China today, and on related topics such as China-Japan relations, Chinese military, ethnic minorities in China. Obviously, these are all very pertinent and relevant issues. They're constantly debated in the mainstream media by both scholars, policymakers, and the public alike. So I figured that this would be the perfect conversation to have at this moment, and there's no one who's really more suited for it than our guest, Dr. June Dreyer. So if you'd like to take a chance to introduce yourself to the audience, just a brief summary or a summation of what you do, what you specialize in, now's your chance.
Actually, I think you've done it very nicely. Uh, you have mentioned that I specialize in China and also really on the broader security issues in Asia in general. And Taiwan, which is a big topic, and Hong Kong, which has fallen on evil days the last couple of years,
Yes.
and ethnic minorities. And the Uyghurs are the most in the news, but they are one of many ethnic minorities in China. And most of them are feeling the pinch because China is trying to assimilate them. And they are complaining that it's wiping out their cultures, which is what China intends to do.
Yes. I think to begin this discussion, we could actually just jump right into what we were briefly talking about before I actually started recording the podcast, which is this interesting viewpoint that you have. You think that, of course, what's hotly debated about and talked about, sort of a hot topic in the media today, are the rising tensions between, on the one hand, this bloc of states such as China, Russia, and Iran, which all are positioning themselves in opposition to the West, with entities like the EU and NATO, and the United States, which obviously exercises a very strong role in NATO. You actually think that, perhaps I'm phrasing this maybe inaccurately if you'd like to correct me, but you think this is sort of overhyped, or there's a bit of a problem in this type of description, in this appraisal of the state of affairs? You think that this description actually lets some states off the hook, essentially? What issues do you take with this appraisal of the current state of global politics? Because it really reminds me actually quite a bit of Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations in the 90s. It seems like we've never really moved beyond that type of thinking, even though he obviously received quite a bit of criticism for that. But it really seems like this civilizational thinking about world politics is very prevalent today, and obviously China's role in that is central. So what do you think of this whole state of affairs, of this type of appraisal? Is it inaccurate?
Well, people who know Sam Huntington, um, everyone agrees he's a lovely, lovely person. He's
Yes.
unfortunately passed away, but everyone who knows him thinks that if he had been anything else but the famous Professor Huntington, this idea of the clash of civilization would have been laughed at. Um, uh, it is true that different civilizations have to adjust, but look at they do adjust. And certainly Japan is a very different civilization from the United States. We're practically best friends. Um, our bestest friends, that's not grammatical, are the British, but then the Japanese, and after that, Taiwan, and those you would call Confucian civilizations or quasi-Confucian civilizations. And then let's look at the Muslim world. Iran and Saudi Arabia hate each other, and uh, the Gulf states are very uneasy also about Iran. And so there is no solidarity in the Muslim world. And he mentioned Africa as a civilization. Africa is not a civilization. It is a conglomeration of very different tribes with very different languages and very different ways of looking at things. So I think from the beginning, the idea of the clash of civilization was heavily flawed. And the Chinese and the Muslims should be at each other's throats because China is an atheistic state and Muslims are very religious. And when the Uyghurs began to be persecuted big time, they've been persecuted ever since 1950, but when they began to be persecuted uh, inordinately in the last, I don't know, 10 years or so, the only Muslim state that complained was Turkey.
I have my own theories for that, but yeah, I'll let you go ahead. Oh,
Oh,
sorry.
no, tell me your theory. That would
Oh,
be
well, my
interesting.
theory, it's not quite immediately relevant to the topic of contemporary China, but you could say it's intertwined in a way. I think if you look at the direction that Erdogan is going in terms of Turkish foreign policy, it's quite evident, even though this isn't really discussed often in the press. It's quite evident that he's actually pushing this strongly ideological approach of pan-Turkist ideology, or you could call it Turanist ideology. And we see that's why he's been cozying up, for example, to far-right factions within Turkey, like the Turkish Grey Wolves, which is this very violent, quasi-terroristic Turkic ultra-nationalist group, despite the fact that this alienates a very large percentage of the population, especially minorities like Kurds and Alevis and etc. And a key part of this pan-Turkic ideology, the central goal is actually a unification of all the Turkic ethnic groups under a single pan-Turkic state. And obviously, as you know, Uyghurs are a Turkic ethnicity, and so are Kazakhs and these other Central Asian ethnicities that have had obviously very tense relations with the Chinese state. And so he might be in it for his own ends. He might see that as an opportunity actually to propagate this ideology, this new ideology that I think Turkish foreign policy is going in. So that's my sort of theory, and that actually explains many people were confused. Well, why exactly is Turkey pushing so strongly for closer ties with Hungary, right? Of all European states. One theory is that they've both experienced democratic backsliding, so there's some commonality there. I think a more compelling theory, even though it sounds a little bit more bizarre, is that if you look at the pan-Turkic mythology, they have this idea there that all these peoples can be grouped under the broader Uralic branch, including Estonians, Finns, and that Hungarians, in a sense, actually possess this ancient this Uralic DNA. So they're connected to the Turkic peoples in that sense. It's obviously very mystical, seems quite puzzling to the Western mind, but I truly believe that Erdogan actually believes in that, and that might be influencing his foreign policy. So that's a bit of a tangent, obviously, but sorry if I
Well, sometimes the fact that people believe it is more important than the fact that it's true. So
exactly.
even
Yes,
if it isn't true, and I just want to point out that uh, Hungarian is not related to any Turkic language.
yes,
It is a Finno-Ugric language, and its nearest cousin, if you will, is Mongolian.
exactly. Yes, of
And the Mongols are not Turkic.
course. Yeah, these Tourists, as part of Turinist ideology, they actually group the Finno-Ugric peoples in with Turkic peoples. It's strange to have this mythological identity and folklore in a sense, but I think that could explain why perhaps Turkey would be more willing to support the Uyghur cause, the Uyghur separatist cause, than other Muslim states to propagate this type of ideology. But actually, now that we're talking about the Uyghurs, I think that's a very, very pertinent segue. I do want to go back to this civilizational world politics lens a little bit later, perhaps. But now, what would you say overall? I know it's a broad question. Is the state of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the fate of the Uyghurs, the state of the Chinese repression of the Uyghurs, has it relaxed at all? Has it intensified? Obviously, it's very clear at this point that a big justification for that the Chinese government provides for its repression of the Uyghurs is that they're connected to this international global terrorist syndicate, that they're connected to groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS. And they point specifically to groups like the ETIM, I believe they're called, the East Turkestan Independence Movement, that had ties to Al Qaeda. Obviously, the Syrian civil war, that was a big factor in this because we know that there was a jihadi pipeline, you could say, of fighters flowing from Xinjiang all the way to Syria, joining these groups like Al Nusra and Al Qaeda, and they played a big role in the fighting force in that war. So China points to all of these factors as justification, I think, for the repression of the Uyghurs. But what would you say about all of this? How legitimate is this idea of a radical Uyghur populace? How obviously that does shouldn't justify repression, but how legitimate is that idea? What's the Chinese government's motives for doing this? What do you think overall of these factors?
I think that the Chinese repressive policies are making more radicals among the Uyghurs than if they had just taken a more easygoing approach. And people tend to dig in their heels in situations like that. And I think that is what has happened. Now, the idea that ETIM, the East Turkestan independence movement, is widespread in Xinjiang, I understand from people who have lived there extensively, is simply not true. That there were a handful of members of ETIM and that are radicalized and have been trained in camps in Pakistan in terrorist techniques, but that there are like 5, 6, 7, 8 people and no more. And the Chinese government has been using this as a justification for repressing all of the others. And unfortunately, we haven't heard much about the Uyghurs recently because the news cycle has moved on. So they're now mesmerized with what's going on, as they should be, in Ukraine and also with Israel and
Gaza.
Hamas. And so, as far as we know, the Uyghurs are not being treated any more nicely than they were. There are over 1 million in these concentration camps. And they are, should say, although the overwhelming majority are Uyghurs, they are not 100% Uyghurs. China has a number of Muslim minorities, including the Kazakhs and indigenous Muslims who are called the Hui, Hui. And they speak Chinese, albeit with a lot of Arabic words thrown in, much in the way people in Brooklyn, which is where I'm from, throw in Yiddish words, to the extent that those of us who are not Jewish also use Yiddish words.
Yes, yes.
But it's kind of like that. And the Hui think they look different. They have more aquiline noses, and therefore they consider themselves kinship with Arabs. But that is a very remote kinship, put it that way.
Mhm.
So there are some of these people in these concentration camps as well. And the idea is you are going to use Chinese, Mandarin Chinese. You're not going to use your native language. You are going to learn Chinese customs. You're going to eat Chinese food. And this is particularly a problem for Muslims, because even when they aren't very good Muslims, for example, the Uyghurs drink, which good Muslims are not supposed to do. But one thing that every Muslim I know doesn't do is eat pork.
Mhm.
And one Uyghur of my acquaintance said that dealing with the Chinese is like having a bowl of steaming pork in front of you. He's talking metaphorically. There's no actual pork in front of you, and there's nothing you can do about it. So our identities are being wiped out. And you probably heard also that most of the people in these concentration camps, again, not all, but most, are men. And what happens to the women? They are left behind, and they have moved Han Chinese into the house of these Muslims. And in many cases, there's only one bed. So the male Han Chinese will sleep in the same bed as the woman. And the idea is they're going to be babies born. And they will not be raised as Muslims.
So would you describe this then, or would you say that it's fair to characterize this as a form of cultural genocide, in a sense,
Yes,
to communicate the gravity of the situation.
exactly. They want to not necessarily destroy every human being, but they want to destroy the language and the culture and any marker of differentness with the Han Chinese population.
I've actually even heard reports that the Chinese government is specifically encouraging intermarriages between ethnic Uyghurs and ethnic Han because they think that this will assimilate the Uyghur population into the Han. I don't know if you what your thoughts are on that. Is that something you've heard of or
Well, yes, but again, it's not something that is going to happen voluntarily
of course, yes.
because of the food problem. And for a Muslim to marry a non-Muslim used to be enough to set off a holy war among the Muslims.
Yes. Hmm.
And there's no hope of a holy war right now because the system is so repressive. But it is going to be resisted. And that might be one reason for moving the Han Chinese into the homes of the Uyghurs, because you don't get to say no. I mean, this is going to be rape.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, and you just I think you phrased it very poignantly when you said that these repressive policies, if anything, are only going to exacerbate this terroristic threat. They may ultimately backfire on the Chinese government, as we've seen, for example, with these terrorist attacks in the past, like the 2014 Kunming attacks. Again, I'm very bad at the Chinese pronunciation, of course, but these terroristic attacks. And when you said that, that actually reminded me of this thesis by the political scientist Robert Pape. He had a similar conclusion. He quite famously stated that a major cause, if not the foremost cause of suicide bombings throughout the 80s, 90s, 2000s, even 2010s in his later research was not so much this Islamist religious ideology as much as the fact that foreign occupation of peoples, of various peoples and ethnic groups, was promoting those ethnic groups to revolt in this secular, more nationalistic uprising, and suicide terrorism was viewed as the most efficient means of affecting that type of change. It's a reaction to foreign occupation. That was at the root of his thesis. And I know that's not exactly what's at play in China, but it does seem to me to be there does seem to be a similar set of circumstances happening here. I mean, it's backfiring on them tremendously. Obviously, greater intensification of the repression of these cultural genocide policies, or if anything, do you think that they're just going to lead to a greater Islamist consciousness among the Uyghur people? Because many people, I think, would ideally like this to be a more secular revolt or insurrection, secular resistance, because they fear that, well, if the Uyghurs become more devout in their adherence to the Islamic faith, then the chance of radicalization is going to increase. The chance that they're going to join these terrorist groups overseas is going to increase. Do you think, though, that the repression of the Uyghurs and the intensification of this repression is going to lead to a greater uh, zealotry and a greater adherence and fanaticism vis-a-vis the Islamic faith among the Uyghurs? What type of effect do you think this is going to have?
So far, I don't see any evidence of that.
Hmm.
It's more of a, you're not like us. You came into our area. We didn't want you. You're exploiting us. You're taking good jobs, and we're not getting the benefit.
Yes. So then, of overall factions like the East Turkestan is independence movement are not prevalent whatsoever. Say among the Uyghur people, they're not a prevalent.
It is probably not prevalent, but again, this is very murky because back in 2012, our State Department, which was at the time cozying up to China,
Yes.
let's make friends. 9/11 had happened. We need friends. And it put ETIM, the East Turkestan Independence Movement, on its list of terrorist organizations. And people who know the Uyghurs intimately, lived there, worked there, say it's just not true. And the State Department insisted, yes, it is, it's true. And year before last, they took that team off the terror watch list.
Hmm.
So I can only think that the State Department was bending over backwards to be nice to the Chinese in 2012 and has decided that the climate has changed, so it no longer needs to pretend something that isn't true.
So why do you think that is, and what do you think is the central factor behind this change in policy? Is it because the tensions with the Chinese state have increased so drastically that perhaps they view Uyghur dissidents as a force that they can maybe weaponize against the Chinese government? I know that sounds a bit conspiratorial, but what do you think is the main reason for this shift?
I don't think the State Department thinks the Uyghurs can be weaponized.
Mhm.
It's just that the Uyghurs' human rights have been so badly trampled on that a team no longer seemed like an issue. And it
Mhm.
probably wasn't true in the first place, that a team was full of
Terrorists.
fanatical separatists.
Yes, yes, yes. I see. So essentially, the human rights abuses escalated to the point that they became impossible to ignore. You
Yeah.
think that's a factor here? I see, I see. And in regards then to the future of the Uyghurs, I mean, how grim is this future? Are there any prospects for perhaps a revitalization of Uyghur identity, for resistance, or do you think that this process of cultural genocide is just only going to escalate from here? What do you see as the fate of the Uyghurs? It's obviously very.
I don't, I should tell you at the start that I'm a pessimist by nature. So uh, for me, it doesn't seem like the Uyghurs have much of a chance. They are fewer and fewer of them are learning. Their the instruction in your own language, which is guaranteed by the Chinese Constitution, by the way, is just not being done anymore. And this is not only happening in Xinjiang, it is happening in Tibet, it is happening in Inner Mongolia, where kids are not being taught in their native languages. And the idea is to make them forget it as soon as possible. And the argument is, who needs this? It's not a widespread language, and you would be better off learning Russian or English if you're going to learn another language besides Chinese.
Mhm. I see. So your
So I'm
prediction,
pessimistic.
pessimistic prognostications, yes.
Yeah.
Well, if that's the case, then how would you describe the relation of other majority Muslim ethnic or ethno-religious groups in China to the Chinese state, to the Chinese government? Because obviously, as you mentioned, there are not just Uyghurs, but there are also the Hui Muslims. There are Kazakhs. There are perhaps these other Central Asian ethnicities. Are those groups also subject to these types of repressive policies? From what I know, it seems like the Hui perhaps are on a more equal footing with the Chinese state. They're not really subject to this degree of repression. So, what do you think explains that disparity then? That seems like quite an important
Well,
question.
the Hui have always lived, or many of them have always lived in close proximity to the Han Chinese. And for example, if you go to Shanghai, you can find halal markets. And the Han Chinese themselves like to shop there because, frankly, the sanitation in China is disgusting. And the halal butcher shops, for example, have a reputation for being more clean and sanitary.
Yes.
And but now there is something, a so-called autonomous region, meaning it has the name autonomous region, but it's not really autonomous. And um, Hui live in a concentration there, and their mosques have been getting destroyed, and the the pretext is, okay, this was an illegal mosque. The government never approved it, and who knows, because land contracts. If you built a mosque 400 years ago, you didn't need to get a legal contract for it, so it may not have one. And now the government is saying, well, you haven't got one. We're going to tear it down. So they have been attacked. And in general, there have been a lot of problems because in that area because Islamic law is not the same as Chinese law. For example, the law of inheritance, things like that. And it's difficult to reconcile the two. And they were doing reasonably well in many ways until maybe 10 years ago. And then all of a sudden the government was saying it's our way or the highway kind of thing.
Yes.
So things have gotten more difficult even for the way.
So they're also subject to this repression, these repressive state policies.
Yes.
Wow, that's tragic. Um, it seems actually as if this Zoom meeting is about to time out. So I think that's gonna put a nice wrap around to the discussion. It was more so focused on ethnic minorities in China, religion in China, the status of Islam in China. I think we're gonna have to end the recording here, but a brief but very, very dense and informative discussion. So thank you very much for taking your time to record this for me. I really, really appreciate it. You're probably one of the most knowledgeable people on the matter of China today. So again, just thank you very much. I just wanted to express my gratitude before the meeting time's out.
Well, I'm delighted we got a chance to talk.